Welcome to another episode of the Growth Focus podcast, where we bring together tech leaders from all across the globe to talk all things tech. My name is Gary Lafferty, I'm your host, and on this episode I'm very pleased to have Denali from Haystack Health, and she's going to be sharing some of her insights and her expertise, so hopefully we could all grow. So Denali, it's an absolute pleasure having you here today. If I could just ask you to give us a little introduction about yourself, how you got started in tech, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so I have a winding path on how I got into tech. I originally started in the behavioral health space, and I did behavioral health research and did clinical mental health counseling, actually. So I was working in a psychiatry clinic doing counseling for the under and uninsured and for active psych patients. And through that process, it was through when EHRs were really becoming a big thing and to standardize. And so we went through an actual Epic implementation. And so I was an end user at the time and became a super user in the clinic. So I was a user of the EHR software. And then through that process, decided that really was sort of fascinated by it and how the cross section of behavioral health and IT could really come together. So I made the transition and actually ended up going to work for the EHR company for Epic at the time and started implementing software. So understanding some of as an end user, how it was actually used and what software it looked like, and then moving to generally supporting some of the business development work that happens in that organization. And this is unfortunately in the telehealth space, which was probably about 8 years before it became like a big thing. And so eventually made a transition into sort of an adjacent technology space that was in the general area, focusing on clinical trials software. So in the clinical trials space, we supported organizations that are going to be running the clinical trials. So there's the pharma companies who are the sponsors of the trials, have the drugs or the medical devices, and then there's the actual sites working with the patients. So again, sort of tangentially related to my work in clinic, but working with those sites, so health systems, medical centers, hospitals, to actually run those clinical trials and all the things they have to do with recruiting patients and negotiating budgets and enrolling patients and collecting clinical data and invoicing and all those things. So the systems that help support those folks. And through that grew into sort of overseeing the team and then eventually VP of research site, so selling technology and services into those organizations. And I would say the key piece there is that as that company grew over time, so started at about 100 through M&A and inorganic growth, became about 1,200 by the time I was looking to leave about 18 months ago, and got approached by my current company to come and focus just as they were sort of getting into the commercialization of their process, to sort of come and run their commercial engine. So about 18 months ago, made that transition, and that's why I'm at Haystack today.
Right. Well, so that's quite a varied career from there
Winding.
to where you got to. Yeah, actually winding and so I want to dial back a little bit, don't I? Because it's fascinating because I don't think I've actually interviewed anyone who was a user first before they got into that industry. So what was it about being what was the draw? What was the fascination when you were a user and to quote your term, a super user? I don't even know what that is, but if you could explain, what is a super user and how do you go from super user and go, I want to be part of this?
Yeah, so it was an Epic implementation. Sort of as they're rolling it out, they identify folks in the clinics to become those super users who then help their peers with the software. At the time, I was one of the more younger folks in the clinic and was sort of elected into this role. And where I thought it was fascinating is that you can solve small problems individually, contributing, and I think that's great, and that's great for some folks. But if you think about sort of a larger macro impact on what you can do with technology and services, being part of something that could be bigger, more impactful at a macro scale was fascinating to me. And it was just I always say I'm sort of a perpetual student, and so it was just more to learn and something new to learn. So that had sort of that innate draw to it as well, which I think you can kind of see as it tracks over my career anyway, like trying new things because there's always more to learn, and I find that fascinating. And then ended up in that, and then tangentially moved to clinical trials, sort of always with that tech underpinning, just because I think it is, again, you can make a macro impact in that capacity as opposed to sort of in the user group. But I think it was critically important, I think, for me to have that user experience. I think in tech, and so one of the biggest challenges I think I see across tech and more specifically the clinical trial space is you get technologists inventing technology without knowing what this problem is. So they assume they
Yeah.
know what the problem is. They assume they know what their solution is going to be for this assumed problem. And in actuality, is that what the challenges people are actually having, and is this solution actually going to fix? And so I think having that either user acceptance testing or having that sort of dynamic and awareness of who the end users are is so important that I think it's missed, and I think really helped me on my sort of progression and being able to sort of crosswalk some of those
Yeah.
landscapes.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think that's something I want to come back to actually. Now
Yeah.
you think that, but before I do, for those of us who haven't, people out there who hadn't heard of Haystack Health, do you want to mind telling us what is it that Haystack Health does? Who does
Yeah.
it serve? Maybe the challenges that it solves. If you could explain that to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So Haystack Health, we are a clinical trials recruitment company, and focusing on patient enrollments into clinical trials. So it's how do we solve that problem? And so for folks who aren't in the clinical trial space, aren't familiar with it, patient enrollment in clinical trials is one of like the most omnipresent and persistent issues in the trial space. Just getting patients enrolled, having patients continue to be engaged, finding those patients who match the clinical trial. So all of the eligibility criteria, inclusion, exclusion, how do you find those patients to actually participate in the trials? And so what we do is we look at patient data and trial data, so that I&E criteria, and try to identify and crosswalk through AI and predictive and deterministic modeling who those patients are, and then surfacing them up to actually be enrolled in the trial. Now, I would say it's multifaceted. It's not just, we find the patients. I think there's other things to look at as well. So it's identifying through that same engine, right, of where those patient populations are. So are we opening trial sites in the right area? So site selection work. Are we activating the correct sites for these trials who actually have access to the patients? And then also even more upstream to say, how are we looking at protocol design to make sure the I&E criteria is actually representative of patients in the population? Oftentimes, the soapbox I can get on here and I won't, but we design research for unicorns, not actual people, and then we apply that medicine to actual people. So there's just some disconnects there. So how do we sort of solve that problem? And again, it's through that sort of that engine that we're building that can be pointed the analytics in multiple different directions, but with the ultimate focus of enrolling patients on clinical trials through technology and then services to sort of do that last mile work.
So let's talk about this, enrolling clients, because it may seem like a really simple role. Go and grab a load of people, I got some trials I want to do, just go and grab me a bunch of people from that. But as we were talking before, it's not that easy. It's multifaceted, it's multi-journey. Can maybe take us through some of that journey and how tech is helping you do that?
Yeah, and I would just say that the biggest challenges as you look at these trials or these protocols, they can have upwards of 40 different criteria to say the patient must have this diagnosis on this medication, not this medication, they can't have this. So finding a patient who matches that profile can be really challenging. And so through technology, you can mine the data sources. And I think a lot of folks look at EHR data. We're going to look at the clinical data. We're going to look at these patients. And one of the differentiators I think that Haystack has really been able to get at, which I think is cool, is that if you're looking at EHR data, you're just looking at the four walls within where the site is. If you think about oncology patients, 80% of oncology patients aren't at an academic research site. They're in community oncology clinics where they're not going to have the same access to research. So how do we increase access to research for those patients in an equitable way? And so what we started looking at is, how do we get access to those patients? And one, people don't want to give you EHR access record. Right? I mean, you look at the Change Healthcare fiasco that happened. I think there was a stat I saw that was cybersecurity attacks are up 90% or something in healthcare. It's absolutely bonkers. So folks don't want to give you their data. And then you're only accessing data in those sites. And so we started thinking about how else can we access additional populations. And really what we decided to nail down into is looking at how do we look at claims data. That's going to be, everyone's going to sort of have that available to them, and you're going to have access not just to the one site, but across the community. So looking within those claims databases to find access to those patients who are at the site, but also out in the community. And we do that through the technology, the machine learning and the predictive and deterministic modeling that we build out. And I think that's the piece of it, identifying those patients. But then I'm also a big believer in you can have a technology, but you also need people and process to make it happen. It's not always the sexy, shiny technology that's going to fix it. And so what we do is we have a clinical team and an operations team that actually does some of that last mile work as well. So we find the patients, but great, now we're going to find the patients. We're going to work with their provider. We're going to work with the pharma company or the sites to educate those patients, then ultimately get them referred into the sites, or even maybe bring research to the site that they're currently at, so the patient's not moving around as much. So that's one of the sort of core things of how we kind of use technology to find those patients. And then sometimes it's just elbow grease to get those patients educated and enrolled.
Gotcha. Yeah, gotcha. So what would you say is then, you may have covered it, but I'm sure there's more. What would you think is one of the biggest misconceptions that your clients have when it comes to doing the clinical trials? In other words, what don't they see? What are they expecting and compared to what they think happens?
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating. So I think if you think about the clinical trial space, there's, like I said, there's the pharma companies who, the pharmaceuticals and device companies, they have the sites. But the other sort of client base that we work with are actually health plans. And they have the claims data and they have a vested interest in sort of, their members having equitable access to trials. But if you think about it, I think one of the biggest challenges is that a lot of, as invested into healthcare as health plans are, obviously it's what they do, clinical trials isn't really something that's on their radar. And so a lot of what we do is education in some of that, as we're working with that particular population, say, this is actually how clinical trials are impacting your member base and your member population, and this is why it's beneficial to you. And so just doing some of that crosswalk where my background has been in the clinical trials space and software space, so that's sort of what I have been doing for over a decade. But I think a lot of the health plan folks, it's just not in their day-to-day. So it's the education component of it has been sort of the biggest piece, especially in that population.
Gotcha. So talking about different types of clientele, what strategies are you currently using to go out there and educate your marketplace? So, because obviously, the more you can educate them on how to buy, what to expect, the easier the job is. What kind of methods and strategies are you currently using to get that message across out there?
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple. Some is just conversation and education, just sort of having conversations like this, having conversations with counterparts about clinical trials and what that looks like. The other big piece is really using the data to showcase what this actually looks like. And so being able to look through and showcase, like, in your database, this is what the impact could be, and sort of having that sort of hard, data and facts, especially when you're thinking about folks who are very data driven from a, claims and numbers perspective. I think that's pretty impactful. So it's also knowing sort of who that market segment is. And, when we work with life science companies, that's going to be wholly different, where they're maybe not as familiar with some of the claims and health insurance perspective and how that sort of ties together. So it's sort of integrating the markets and educating them on the other pieces of it, where they're not as familiar. And again, I think research is highly regulated, insurance is highly regulated, very data, very black and white. So that's been that has been particularly effective for those marketplaces. And I think we also work with sites as well, less so from a sort of clientele and go-to-market perspective, but certainly they're the ones running the trials. They're the ones who have the patients. We need to know what they're doing. And that is a lot more just relationship building and just having those conversations and understanding who they are. So it's also sort of understanding why folks are in it and how they see the world and meeting them where they're at.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it is, as you say, it's more about the conversational part, talking to the right people, getting out there, and a two-way street, isn't it? It's obviously learning what they're looking for, what their misconceptions are, and just re-educating them on what reality is and how it works.
Yeah,
Because they also have every single client, no matter what industry you're in, will also have a misconception about what an ideal client is and what you actually do, as a vendor and whatnot. So let's shift slightly to something which you mentioned slightly earlier. It's really hard to have a tech conversation and not mention AI. You mentioned AI a little bit earlier on. So how are you and Haystack using AI effectively now to enhance your business, to make your business more efficient and more productive?
Yeah, and I think so. I always think it's funny. I think AI, when you go to like these conferences, and it's the buzzword now, right? Like before it was, we had other things. Now it's AI, and so every single booth that you're walking the exhibit hall is talking AI this, AI that. I think it's interesting because I think everyone is using AI. If you're not, you're behind the ball. But in my perspective, like, you're using texting, your phone's recommending what's your next word going to be. Like, everyone is using it for something. So I think it's more the how you do it, not the what. And I think focusing on like we're doing what we're doing through AI as a tool. It's a tool. It's not it's not a solution in itself. It's just a tool to execute what you're doing. But we use a couple of different types of AI at Haystack. focus on machine learning. We do modeling. We also have another component looking at, NLP and OCR for unstructured data evaluation. So there's a couple of different tactics and tools we use. Particularly with claims data, you're going to focus more on machine learning and the modeling aspects of it, because it's not, claims isn't really using unstructured data. But that's sort of the general focus of how we've used it. And then training it off of, specific data sources that we know are going to be impactful. So it's representative of what we're looking for.
Right. And where do you see the future of AI within a company? You quite rightly say it's a tool. You're the master, that's the slave, effectively. That's what AI really should be, as opposed to the other way around. And when we talk a lot of cybersecurity, you mentioned hacks and things like that. And with other people, we tend to listen, especially those who are not necessarily well versed in AI or tech. They tend to worry about AI. But as long as we understand that it is a tool, it helps us, it makes us more efficient to what it is, and we are the masters of it, rather than the other way around. Where do you see the future use of AI within your industry, within your company, growing from where it is today?
Yeah, so I would love to see us continue to grow out and build modeling. I think it would be fascinating to use it to scale the offering. So, right, so like using NLP to process through massive amounts of data that's available on clinicaltrials.gov, so you can create banks of information. I think that could be something, and make it ultimately, like, clinical trials more accessible to everyone. Right now, it's a really big challenge to get on clinical trials, even if you really want to, like, knowing what's open and what's in your area and what are the criteria and where does it all look like. And so it would be great to have a more accessible way to process that. And I think AI could be a way to do that at scale, given that there's thousands of trials running at any given time in the US, let alone globally. And so I think making it more accessible and at scale right now, because a lot of organizations are doing this, but it's not necessarily at the massive level to be all inclusive. So I think that could be something that's fascinating. I think within the clinical trial space, there's a lot of applications. There's a lot of talk about how AI could be used, whether it's being a control population even, and identify. So, like, there's a lot of ethics around some of that, but there's a lot of different ways. But I think that it could be applied, whether that's protocol design to make it more inclusive. I think there's a lot of different ways. But yeah, from a Haystack perspective, I would like to see us be able to use it to scale and to how we evaluate protocols and increase access to those. Because that's ultimately, I think, why I'm at Haystack, why I think it's super impactful, is it's really, truly, how do we increase access equitably to all patients? And I think to do that, ultimately, at the most level of effectiveness, it needs to be at scale and all-inclusive for all people and all protocols, and then accessible in a way that people can interact with. So I would like to see us be able to take our offering and scale it through AI, through some modeling.
Gotcha. Yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from with that one. If it can be more accessible, safely accessible to others, where security, especially in such a heavily regulated industry as well, making that the thing. So I now want to shift. I want to talk about you, what you do, your day. So head of strategic partnerships. What does that mean, and how do you spend your day?
Yeah, so Haystack is a startup, and as a head of partnerships, I kind of oversee the commercial engine of the organization. So sales, marketing, partnerships, and then a little bit of everything for those who've worked in the startup world. Have lots of hats. So whether that is working with specific partners, whether that's doing contract discussions, whether that's designing go-to-market messaging. I also think a big piece, I go to conferences, again, sort of getting back to what we talked about at the very, very beginning. I think it is critically important to understand the end users, and so being kind of that voice of the clinical trials space, and who are the end users, who's going to be impacted, why are we doing this, making sure the messaging is still resonating from a marketing perspective. Work remotely, which fits me very, very well. And then we travel for conferences, and just continue to sort of provide that end user, and then the feedback loops back to our product team. They're phenomenal, brilliant individuals, sort of working with them to make sure what we're building is meeting market need. So across the board, a little bit of everything. And I think that's the thing I like about it, which is no matter what you do, you're doing something that needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love what you said earlier about, when it's a small startup or just like a scrappy startup. I love using that term because it's scrappy because you've got to try and do everything. Nothing's quite yet smooth. There's lots of things to do. And as you said, wearing multiple hats. It doesn't really matter what your title is
Yep.
to a degree because you're always going to wear a different type of hat. Startups don't have the luxury of saying, this is my title, this is the only thing I do. But what I want to talk about is strategic partnerships. And this is the intriguing part because the more people that I work with, the more people that I interview in partnerships and in masterminds, what we're actually seeing now is a lot of the successful companies, the faster growing companies, are using not just the ICP, their ideal client, it's their ideal partnership to grow their businesses, using partnerships to walk through practically open doors. But there's a right way and there's a wrong way to do partnerships. What insights do you have for us, or for those who are listening, think, I keep hearing about partnerships, but I'm not quite sure what the right way or wrong way of doing it is.
And I think I've certainly been part of good partnerships and certainly been part of bad partnerships. I think let's start with good. I think good partnerships are ones where there is truly benefit to both sides. I think there is a danger of people trying to boil the ocean and do everything themselves. And so why reinvent the wheel? Work with someone else who's already done it and who's established. And then you can, but make sure you're bringing value to them too. I think sometimes it's I can get this from this person or this company, but it's making sure for it to be a partnership, it has to be mutual. And I think the relationship also has to have that flavor to it, right? It's not one side trying to get more from the other. It has to be a genuinely when we have a shared mission, vision, end goal in sight, and then we both bring something to the table, and it's a give and take. We're not trying to get more than we're taking. We're trying to be in a truly symbiotic relationship. I think poor partnerships are kind of just the converse of that, right? You have a different end goal in mind, or if one is viewing it more as like a client relationship where it's I'm trying to get something from you or give something to you, and just not having that open and honest shared endpoint and shared value across the board. And I think it's also okay to still have great relationships and be like, this isn't a good partnership. We're not aligned, and that's okay. And being able to have that honest communication, I think, is something that sometimes folks miss, where it's like, I want to be partners, but I'm not seeing where this is overlapping. It becomes like contentious almost. So you try to force something or not, and just sort of and continuing it. I think that's the other piece of it. It's not, this is where the partnership started. We have a great idea. It's continuing to do that exercise over and over again to make sure you're continued to be aligned and you're both seeing value, and being okay to be like, we started this 18 months ago, not really seeing the value. Who are you? No, great. Maybe we'll part ways, and being okay with that too.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point there, Denali, because it very much, as the word says, it's a partnership, it's a relationship. It's if you were dating somebody, sometimes it doesn't work. It's a great idea at the beginning, and sometimes it just runs its course, and it's just not the right time. Lovely people, you're still great people, but it just doesn't work. They're just not aligned in their mission and future moving forward. And I think this is where a lot of businesses who are new to partnerships feel that every green light should be green before we enter it, and now we're into it, we can't get out of it because we came in thinking this, and it's not working like that anymore. And I love what you said earlier. That said, then if we're still got a great relationship, we can break the partnership, and that's the key thing there, isn't it? The relationship stays great,
right? And that doesn't have to be a personal thing, which I think it can get tied up into. The other thing that I just think about, and I don't have an answer for this really, especially in the startup space, where I think folks are so interested in being like, I need to take every partnership that comes my way. Everyone that approaches me and says, hey, I need this, like we should, and you as a startup, you kind of feel like, well, I can't say no, we'll try to make it work. When in actuality, maybe that's just a distraction. So really being conscious about what your partnership values are. So it's not like, hey, we have all these partnerships, look, I did this, but does that actually do anything for you? Versus you just said yes to all the partnerships because you felt you needed to. So I think it is a balance, especially in the scrappy startup space, where you kind of need some of that to get going, but you also have to make sure it's not distracting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, like what you just said there, if you're trying to force that relationship just because you think it's the right thing to do, and because everyone else is doing it, I need more partnerships. I need to do it because everyone else is doing it. That's when it fails and it doesn't last long. There's no longevity to it, and you can actually do more harm than good by forcing that relationship and a partnership from there.
And I would even say the same thing from a client perspective, right? Like, I mean, a lot of times you don't have the luxury of saying no to clients, and I think too, as far as like from a commercial perspective or a sales perspective, I think ideally most relationships are partnerships. You're working together. Just like there may be transactions that happen, but I think ultimately it should be a partnership. But again, not every client's going to be a good fit. Not every partner is going to be a good fit, and saying no needs to be acceptable in the company cultures. I think it's a lot of times not as effective, and then you see the downstream impact. You see products struggling, you see the operations team struggling because something has been pushed through. That's not a fit.
No, that is not good. So that being said, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice for people who are looking to either start doing partnerships with the business or, have suddenly want to completely scrap what they're currently doing and went, okay, I want to do it properly now. I've listened to Denali. I've been doing it all wrong. What are your top 3 tips or strategies you share with us?
I think being authentic is a big one. Authentic in who you are as a company and what you are, and being very honest and transparent about who you are, what you can do, and what your goals are, and setting your own framework, understanding who you are. I think like doing your own personal work. You got to know who you are before you can go in a relationship. You got to know who you are for the other person to know who you are. So first of all, establishing exactly and buttoning up who are you, what are you doing, why are you doing it, and then I think the second piece is then going out there and listening. I think a lot of times folks want to come and be like, this is what I do and this is what my company does. It's like, but it's more about listening to what the other person, the other company, the other organization is looking at and finding the alignment between the two. And then I think the third piece is just that's an iterative process. And so like you're authentic, you know who you are, you're intentional with who you're talking to as you're listening to them and making sure you're making intentional partnerships. And then you're iterating on that. You're continuing to have those conversations, you're continuing to evaluate, I think is going to be key for long-term success. Again, to your point, just because you started dating someone doesn't mean 5 years from now you're going to be with that person, because maybe you grew apart. And you just need to continue to evaluate that and not just sort of become complacent, just being intentional and authentic as you evaluate that continually.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, I think those are really good top 3 tips there. And I love the first one is knowing yourself first. Who are you? What you're bringing to the table? Could it be better? Could it be different? Or what it is? Just because this is who you are doesn't necessarily mean that partnership it will work. But if you get to know yourself, then you know where your mission lies and your values lies.
Yeah.
So that's a nice little segue into what something you mentioned earlier is about clients. I'm a great believer when I'm working with my clients and growing my businesses, it's all about marketing, it's about attracting, but also repelling. You want to attract the people you want, but you also want your marketing should repel the people that you do not want. And as you quite rightly said, it's sometimes we've got to learn how to say no. We've got to say no to a client. Yes, you might be a bit cash strapped, especially in a startup, especially if you're bootstrapping it and you want to take it, but there is dangers of taking the wrong client. What insights have you got from that? Because especially as you said earlier, is that been an example of a wrong client that you've had that you could share with us, or what kind of insights could you share?
Yeah, I think it's well, I think there's 2 types of clients that I just really struggle with. That I think often are ones that I think that, again, if you're having that conversation, they're asking for something that you don't really do, say no. And that's okay to be like, we have A, you want B. I'm not going to be like, yes, maybe we could get you into this. Like, let's try. And so making sure that what they actually want is aligned. And I also just think from and I'm a huge believer in this is when I made the move to Haystack, it was a huge piece of the conversation was culture. You have to make sure not only what you want is aligned, but culturally, do you have shared values as you look at how the companies work and structure and what they value. I think that culturally is a big piece, and I think sometimes there are clients that are just not going to be a good fit culturally, what their expectations are, what their demands are, how they interact, making sure that's aligned as well. But I also think, too, to your point, like being able to say no, and I have two small kids, and it's like the idea of, you ever done the marshmallow experiment, where you get one marshmallow now, but if you don't eat it for 5 minutes, you get 5 marshmallows. And so it's like, yes, you could say yes to a client right now and get that immediate revenue stream. But if you wait just a little bit, if you can do it, instead of wasting your resources on that one client who maybe is giving you one marshmallow but not a great fit, and you are able to sort of wait, you can wait for a client who's really going to be a good fit, and you're going to get the returns later. It's just a long game, not the short game.
Yeah, I think that's an absolute valid point. Is you're in business for the long term. If anyone's there listening and think I'm only in the business for the short term, maybe you shouldn't be in business. I mean, long term is there, because at the end of the day, whether you're still running it or you sell it or you get out of it or you merge, it's still a long term thing. You build a business for the long term relationships rather than the short term quick wins that you have. And so, just diving a little bit more into that, because it is a fascinating topic. It's something which I'm having with my clients all the time, is knowing your worth. Yes, you want that quick gain, but if you're going to literally bow down to every single client because you haven't learned to say no, or you don't know, like you said earlier, Denali, knowing yourself, doing the work on yourself and your company. What is your company value? What is your long-term gain? You will bow to other people's demands. But if
It gets dangerous. I mean, it gets so dangerous, right? I think it's this, and again, I'll go back to some of back in the early, back in undergrad, we talked about this psych experiment that happened that you have to pay for an iPad versus get one for free. The value you intrinsically see in that iPad is going to be different. Someone just gives you, like, yeah, I kind of use it for some stuff. Like, I have my phone, I have my computer, like, it's fine. But if you pay a couple $100s, you're like, yes, and I can do all these cool things on it. And it's the same concept. If you're bowing down to these clients, you're doing whatever they want, you're letting them kind of railroad, they're going to stop seeing some of the intrinsic value you're bringing to the table, because you're just kind of giving away what you got. You're not actually like, no, this is worth money and this is why. And then they're going to start treating it with more respect as well. So sort of as your point, like go to market, your brand reputation is going to be impacted by how you interact with those clients and what you do and don't let them get away with.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, it's going to affect your brand, but also the way that people see you as a person. If you imagine going to a doctor and saying, "Hey, I've got something wrong with me. Just give me some, Tylenol," and the doctor's going to go, "Well, actually, you need this surgery, blah 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 blah," and you go, "No, just give me some Tylenol." Are you going to have respect for that doctor if he goes, "Okay then"?
Okay, fine.
Just do that then. That's because I think you're right and I'm wrong. And people would begin to see you as not as a powerful authority or credible as you want them to see. So, learning to say no is a vital part of entrepreneurship, which is sadly lagging behind in building a company.
Yes,
People
100%.
become very, very desperate in doing that. So I'm glad we've touched on that and we've talked a little bit about that, Denali. So again, look, I can't believe where the time has gone. It goes so quickly when you have that.
Does.
So I've got this last question for you, Denali, and it's one I ask almost every one of my guests. Is this: knowing what you know now, in this vast knowledge of having gone from university through to the user group to where you are now to head of strategic partnerships at Haystack. If you could give your younger self one piece of advice, what would that be?
So I think it would be that no one really knows what they're doing. So I think when you're young, you think that everyone knows what's going on, everyone has a plan, everyone is like super fitted, like knows exactly what they're doing. I think the longer I've been in this, like everyone is doing their best, everyone is trying their hardest, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve a seat at the table. There's probably nothing super special about the people who are sitting at the table besides the fact they decided to sit down at the table. So just being able to be confident enough to be like, you deserve a space there. There's nothing special, like no milestone, no big aha moment that you're gonna have that's gonna be like, now you can sit at the table. Everyone has value, and being confident enough to take that, I think is key. It's key for folks.
That's a brilliant piece. That's a lovely piece to end on. A great piece of advice there. So, Denali, if somebody wants to get hold of you, maybe they want to potentially work with you or form a partnership with you, what's the best way of getting hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. So check me out on LinkedIn. See me there. Hit me up at Denali at HaystackHealth.com. Happy happy to do email as well. So for first name, haystackhealth.com. Give me a shout or LinkedIn message. I'm always happy to chat with folks, whether that's about tech, startups, clinical trials, doesn't matter.
That's brilliant. Well, I'll make sure I'll put those links into the show notes for you so people can automatically just click on that. Which all just leads me to say, Denali, thank you very much for your time today and sharing your insights. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here today.
Same. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome, Denali. And thank you guys again for joining us on this episode. And as per usual, if you've taken one piece of insight or a nugget that you've heard from Denali, please make sure that you like it and make sure you comment so that others can gain from that as well. But more importantly, please subscribe and share. Let's get these insights and expertise out to the rest of our industry so that we can all be far more successful in our businesses and in our careers. So until next time, thank you again for joining us. Denali, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor having you here today. Until the next episode, please take care and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.